Well, in this study, we're going to get to study someone whose life is down, but we're going to do a lot more than just measure it. Of all the people in Scripture, the only person in all of the Bible to ever be called a man after God's own heart was David. And if there's nothing else fascinating and appealing about David, it's got to be that description of his person. It is always the thing that has pulled me in to understand, wanting to understand and know and experience David's life. What made David a man after God's own heart? So we're going to look at that in this study. David is mentioned more than any other person in the Old Testament in the pages of the New Testament. David was a poet. He was a musician. He was a warrior. He was also a statesman. But we're not, as I said a moment ago, we're not simply going to measure his life after it's down, because David wrote all these songs we call psalms with such extraordinary transparency and with such total vulnerability. So we're going to have the phenomenal experience of being able to trace at least monumental times in David's life and get to look inside his heart, because we're going to pull the Psalms he wrote that were happening at these experiences in his life and understand how David was feeling and what he was thinking, where he came down about what happened, and remembering all the time that this is a man after God's own heart. And we're going to see as we study David's life that, like us, he was anything but perfect, which I find immensely encouraging. But he earned his kingdom's and his people's trust. He earned their respect. And then he forfeited all in just one moment, one time of sensual pleasure. And then we see another side of a great man. We see a man who was lustful as a husband, who had, has a weakness as a father, showed partiality as a leader. And all these things happened to David, and all these things came out of his character. And it makes the description of David as being a man after God's own heart even more phenomenal, even more fascinating. And we're going to follow this outline as we go through our study. He was hunted, he was hounded, he was haunted, and he was healed. He was hunted by his God, literally pursued by God on numerous occasions. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit in our study. He was hounded by his enemies, relentlessly hounded by his enemies. He was haunted by his sin. We're going to go take a look at that and how it feels to deal with conviction and guilt from sin. And then he was healed by his brokenness. And all this experience in David's life, we're going to match up with the songs that he wrote. And we're going to get a look inside his heart, his thoughts, his feelings as we go along through this study. So basically what we have is a heart exposed. And we're going to see the experiences in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but then we're going to see how he felt about it, what he was thinking about it, how his relationship with God was affected by all these events as we look at the songs that he wrote. Well, I want to take just a little bit of time this morning to meet David. And we're not going to do an exhaustive introduction to David's life, because that's actually what the study is going to be about. But just a little bit to meet David here. We're going to understand the world into which he was born, because that's very important to get the context of his life. What was the condition of the kingdom when David was born, the kingdom of Israel? Are you aware? You know what was happening when David was born?
Saul was king.
Pardon? Saul was king. Right.
The nation had just asked God for an earthly king because they wanted to be like everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Samuel was the prophet of God in Israel when David was born. And that was significant because the prophets had always represented God to the people and had spoken with the voice of God to the people. So that was Samuel. Anything you remember about Samuel and his life? The prophet Samuel? One of the great heroes of your life, right? He was born to Hannah. Do you remember that story? That's a fascinating story all by itself. What do you remember about that story? What do you know about Hannah?
Was she the one who wasn't able to have children, and
Right.
she promised God she would give her son to him if she had one? And then she gave him to Eli.
Right. Hannah was barren, suffering an enormous embarrassment and also accusation, because it was believed back in this time that if you were a married woman and had no children, that you'd done something horribly wrong and you were a horrible sinner. She went to the temple every day to pray. In fact, she was praying so earnestly one day that Eli, who was the high priest, thought she was intoxicated and scolded her, and she said, "No, I'm just asking God to give me a son." And she told God, "You'll give me a son. I'm going to give him back to you." His name was Samuel. He went to live with Eli, the priest, because once the son was born, she kept a promise. She gave her son back to the Lord. She took him back to Eli to live at the temple. And when he was a young boy, something very interesting happened. You remember that story? He heard voices. Right. Whose voice was it? Whose voice did he think it was? He thought it was Eli's voice, but it was God speaking to him and calling him. And very early when he was still in his single digits, God was speaking to Samuel and calling him to a very special mission. When Samuel became the prophet of God in Israel, the Philistines were attacking Israel. Okay, now Samuel is now the prophet. He's the adult prophet. We skip through his life. And that's a very interesting verse in 1 Samuel chapter 7. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, which means that the Philistines who were attacking Israel on this particular occasion were at Mizpah. The Israelites were at Shen, and he was standing. So basically, he took a stone and put it between the Philistines and Israel, and he named the stone Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far has the Lord helped us." So the Philistines were subdued and did not invade Israelite territory again. Does that remind you of anything? He took a stone and named it, set it between the Israelites and Philistines, and he named the stone, Ebenezer. Did that ring a bell with anybody? I might be the only one in the room old enough to remember this song. You remember this song right here? "Come thou fount of every blessing." You remember this? "Come thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise." And one of the verses begins like this, and it's always funny because you can see people in the whole congregation think, "What is that?" It's this: "Here I raise mine Ebenezer." Does that ring a bell to anybody? "Hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home." You remember that verse? I'm just wondering. Well, that's the story. And the significance of this Ebenezer stone is that it's an indication of the protection and deliverance of God. And so when the hymn writer wrote this verse, he was talking about, "Here I raise the stone of remembrance that God has delivered me and protected me up till now. And because of that, and by thy help, I've gotten this far, and I hope by your good pleasure safely to arrive at home. You protected me to this place in my life. Here's the stone of remembrance as a symbol of it. And the fact that you've been faithful to me up till now gives me hope that you will be faithful all the way home." That's the idea of the Ebenezer. And I got to thinking about that.